So for the functions write-up, I chose this image, which is an image of a kitchen, which seems kind of random. But I really like the analogy of a function being similar to an appliance, like a kitchen appliance. So for example, a coffee machine. The reason I really like that is because somebody programmed a coffee machine already to do a function, to perform some kind of operation. And all I have to do is like run the coffee machine and it will do a whole bunch of intricate stuff, right? The same thing with like a dishwasher, refrigerator, whatever. It's something that somebody built that I can just basically hit go and it does its thing. Coffee machine, for example, it also can take some inputs, or it does take some inputs. You have like the beans or the grounds and the water. And so you provide those inputs and it uses those inputs to do some stuff, right? Technically, I could use a coffee machine and like pour Tang or something in there instead of coffee grounds. And it, I think, would still work, just would produce a much different result depending on what I put into it, right? Well, a function is the same thing. It's a pre-built set of code or instructions that I can run easily over and over again by just calling the function. Okay, that allows me to repeat a lot of code without me having to write it over and over. Okay. So that's the idea of function. Defining, let's go here. There's a few different ways to define functions, and there actually is a slight difference between them. Don't worry too much about it right now, but one major way of defining a function, first of all, it will always include the keyword function until we get to arrow functions. It will always include the keyword function. And just like our for loops and our if statements, it will be the keyword and then a set of parentheses and then a set of curly braces. And just like our for loops and our if statements, everything inside of the curly braces indicates the code that will run when I run my function. Okay. Unlike if else statements and a for loop, I can give my function a name, or I most oftentimes will give my function a name so that I can call it by name later. So maybe I'll say like, do something. Okay, and this is a function signature. Okay, I have the function keyword, the name of the function, parentheses, curly braces. Everything inside of the curly braces, like I said, is some kind of action that will occur. In this case, all this function does is it console logs hello. Now, how do I, we talked about this earlier today, but how do I call this function? Or I should say, what happens if I run this file right now? Nothing. Why did nothing happen? Yeah, kind of seems like it should have called console log, or it should have console logged hello, but in reality, it didn't do that. All I did was define the function, but I never called it, never executed it. So to call it, what do? Do something, parentheses. Yep. And now when I run it, I get my hello. It actually called the function. And if I call this function 4 times, it will run 4 times. And it's performing this line 2 operation console log. It's performing it 4 times. Questions so far about functions? Yeah.
And should you place your function before the main variable? It's a main arrays of objects.
You don't necessarily have to place your functions in a specific order.
But in some program language, you have each function first, and then the main variable.
Yeah, we don't use main. That's C and C++. Yeah. But we won't in JavaScript.
Not just.
Yeah. So, but that does bring up a good point. There's another way to define a function And that is to set a function value as a variable. Okay, so I can say var my function equals a function. Okay, so var my function equals a function. This is another legitimate way to create a function, right? Now there is a slight difference between these two. And the difference comes with something called hoisting. So I can demonstrate this. Oh my goodness, what is this keyboard doing? Oh my gosh. This is so frustrating. Oh, you know what's going on?
Oh my God, what is it?
This is paired. I think this is paired to the mouse and keyboard over there as well. I think it's paired to both of them.
In the other classroom?
In the other classroom. It must be, because it's like randomly moving up and down. I don't know. I might be wrong.
They had trouble with it.
I might go unpair everything and do it. Okay. In this example, I'm calling do something chronologically before I ever define do something, the do something function, and I'm calling my function before I ever define my function. Okay, and let's see what happens. Okay, here I get do something to work correctly, right? It console logged hello. But here it said my function is not defined. So functions that are declared as a function declaration like this, they are hoisted, meaning essentially when the computer reads it, it will take all of those and kind of pretend like I had put them at the top of the file. So technically, when you write a function like this, you can execute it before you create it in the file chronologically. Whereas functions like this are function expressions. Or is it the other way around? It doesn't matter. When you set a function to a variable, it is not hoisted, and therefore trying to call it before you define it is a syntax error. It crashes.
It's an expression.
This one's an expression. So it doesn't really matter to me which one you choose. I would be consistent, like choose which one you like more and then just be consistent. I tend to write my functions this way, but I also tend to try not to call them before I define them because that can be confusing for other programmers. Okay, so I wouldn't actually do this just because I could. I would still put it afterwards. We'll make a note of this. Okay. All right. So this is great. Functions help us reuse code, but it's also important that our functions have the ability to act differently under different circumstances. Kind of a contrived example that I think illustrates this is if I were to make a function called add, and I were to have that function return 1 + 1. Okay, why is this a really limited function? Yeah, it only does one thing. You can only add 1 and 1. So I might as well, to be explicit, I might as well call it add 1 and 1. Okay, but that's lame because then let's say I need another function that adds 1 and 2. I mean, I'm not saving any time by doing this, am I? Add 1 and 2. Well, I'm going to talk about the return statement in a second. So this is dumb, right? This doesn't help me reuse this function in any way. So how can I change my function so that I can specify when I'm calling it the numbers that I want to add? Parameters. So these parentheses are useful because I can add parameters in here. These parameters are just variable names. That's all they are. They're variables that I'm like stuffing into my function. So when I say function add, and then I say something like num1, comma, num2, what I'm saying is I'm defining a function called add that will take 2 parameters. And I can use those 2 parameters in the code that I'm executing to do something different. So instead of specifying or hard coding 1 plus 1, I could say return num1 plus num2, whatever those numbers are. Okay. Ahead of time as a programmer, I don't know or care what they're going to put into those parameters. All I know is that I want to add them together and return the result. So now something needs to change when I call this function. Before, without any parameters, this is how I would call this function. What do I need to change now? I need to, because when I define the function, I, so to speak, promised that I would include 2 parameters there. I need to give 2 parameters to the function that I'm calling. So I can say like 4, comma 5. Parameters are always separated by commas, both when they are in the definition and when I pass them in as arguments. So 4, comma 5. So this should do what? Yeah. Yes, and you're right. And that's going to bring us to our next point. What happened? I remembered to call my function.
Just stored it instead of showing.
It's returning.
Value, but you're not really displaying it.
Yeah. So this brings us to the difference between a return statement and a console log statement. They're very different ideas. They're 2 totally separate things, but when you're learning to program, people tend to use them to accomplish similar aims, and I think it can be confusing for people who first learn programming. A console log is a debugging tool. It's just for the developer. In very few circumstances will that ever be helpful to the end user. Okay? A console log is just really for you to see that things are working. So think of it as a debugging tool. A return actually makes it so that the function gives a value back to your program. Think of it in the analogy with the coffee machine. A return statement would be like the coffee machine producing coffee in a pot that can be used, right? A console log would be like the coffee machine saying, I made coffee out loud, but not actually giving you anything, right? It'd be like you press a button on a coffee machine that says, I made coffee, and you look and there's nothing in the pot. What? No, you didn't. You didn't return anything. So that's what a return is, okay? Oftentimes you'll see us use console log just as a debugging tool so we can see what's happening. Because clearly when I run this, under the hood, it's actually working. It's not crashing, but I can't see anything. I don't know that my add function worked, right? So more often than not, your functions will likely return something that's useful to your program later. How can I, when I'm calling my add function, how can I save that value? Okay, we want a coffee machine that has a coffee pot to catch the coffee. We don't want it to just spill out into the drain, right? How can I save the value that's being returned here?
Like on-click, can you do that? Or
On-click would be a little different realm, but yes, you could do that. A variable. Yeah, somebody said a variable. Yeah, I could save it as a variable. Any data that I want to save, I usually end up saving as a variable, right? And so I can say like var sum equals the thing that gets returned by calling add 4 and 5. So what the computer does is it says, oh, I'm creating a new variable. I'm setting its value to, oh wait, I have to go figure out what this is. And so it goes to the add function and it says num1 is 4, num2 is 5. And I need to get back the sum of those two. So then it turns this into 9. And now I have a new variable with the sum of 9. Or with the new variable whose value is 9, I should say. And now I could, as a developer that needs to see what the heck is going on here, I could console log what sum is and verify that my function is working correctly. Does that make sense, the difference between console log and return? That's like a huge stumbling block I found for the beginning of the class, if we don't explain it. Return is really what you'll want to do. Console log is just to make sure that it worked correctly. Okay. Okay. Return statement. Okay. Oh yeah, function scopes.
can you also put in console log in the function?
Oh yes. Okay. That good question. Let's do this. What's going to happen here?
Is that original one?
Okay, what's going to happen when I run this?
I'm gonna run the console.
Nothing shows up. Why is that?
Because anything that goes after return call is pretty much returning the thing back to.
Yeah.
Return takes the place.
Return ends a function. Okay, return is the very last thing that a function will run. And then it will say, I'm done, my job's done. It doesn't care if there's 100,000 lines of code in this function below a return statement. If it finds a return, it won't run any of those. So if you have something that you want to happen before or while the function is still running, like a console log, it needs to happen before the return. Okay? Any questions about that? So that seems straightforward. Tell me about this function. Call this, well, I mean, here, one second. I'm trying to remember that I'm handing these out as notes. I don't want to keep changing everything. Okay. Say that again.
What you had before, so yeah, that system login is gonna run through it one time, it's gonna hit the return, and then it's gonna be done.
Yeah. Okay, this is an easy thing to get caught up in, or rather an easy gotcha, right? Because you have return, remember that's ending the function. It doesn't care about your for loop. It sees a return and it ends the function. And so it kind of takes precedence over the for loop deciding if it should go again. The function's like, nope, you're done. We're done. The whole function's done. And so we only get the console log the very first time, then we hit return, and it's done. In this case, I'm returning I, but I could just say return, and then my function wouldn't return anything, but it would effectively kill the function. So that happens sometimes too. If you don't need your function to return value, but just to do some kind of operation and then die, you can just say return. That'll work. Okay. Any other questions so far? The parameters thing is kind of heavy like that. That can take some time to get used to if you're not already. Okay. Okay, scope. The last thing I want to talk about before we do the exercise is function scoping, variable scoping. Before I come up with an example, the idea of variable scoping is that when you declare a variable outside of a function, it will be accessible to your entire program, including inside of functions. So I might have something like var name equals Steve, and then have a function that console logs hi, comma, plus name. Okay, and what's this gonna log?
Hi, Steve.
Okay, so we get hi, Steve. The name variable was declared outside of the function, and so it has access to that because this is considered a global variable, meaning it's accessible globally to your program in any part of your program.
Does it have to be above the functions whenever you're going to use it, or can it be anywhere?
It has to be above where you're calling the function, I believe. So like
It could be like under the
if I do
function,
this,
but it has to be above where you're calling it.
I think so. So if I do this, it doesn't know what Steve is. But if I move that there, it knows. Yeah, so it depends on where I'm calling. Okay, however, if I do this, what's it gonna do?
Maybe it's sort of fine, but
Yeah. So first of all, when I called say hi, it worked fine, right? The function had access to the name variable because the name variable was defined inside of the function. However, Afterwards, when I try to access that name variable again, it's gone. I just don't have access to it. And it actually crashed the program. Right? It said name is not defined. Okay, so this is the idea of variable scoping. A variable is scoped, or rather only exists, only is accessible inside of the function if it's been declared inside of a function. So variables declared inside of a function are only accessible inside of a function. If for whatever reason you wanted access to that variable outside, you'd need to make sure to return it from the function. And then you would have access to it by saving it in a variable. So here I'm calling say hi. Calling say hi returns name. I'm saving it as a global variable called name. And now I have access to something called name.
What if you declare that variable, like, for a function?
Yeah, so let's look at it. Let's look at that. So if we declare the variable before the function, let me get rid of return. Get rid of that. First of all, if I use the same variable name, let's say Joanne. So here I'm declaring the variable name, then I'm creating a function where I'm also declaring a variable called name. The global one is called Joanne, the local or the locally scoped one, function scoped one is Steve. I call the function and then I console log hello again name. What's going to show up in my It's not so much that they override, it's that it accesses the closest thing that is not undefined. So here, calling say hi, it says this is more locally scoped. This is the first thing I can find is the name variable called Steve. And so it says, hi Steve. Down here, it says I need to find a variable called name. And it has no idea about this function because that name has been scoped to that function. But then it does find this name, and that's the one that it wants.
So I probably never want to do that in the real world.
Global,
Get confused down the road.
global variables are generally frowned upon.
So if you just took out the variable named Steve?
Oh, good. Yeah, so this will illustrate that as well. So now if I do that, what do you think will show up here? Yeah, it should be Joanne both times. So what it did is it said, let me first look inside of myself. The function said this, like, let me look in this function for a variable called name. And it said, we don't have one, but we do have a globally available variable called name. And so it used that one. Okay, and then down here, it again used the global variable name. What about this? So now I have a parameter called name. Yeah. So here, when I tell it that I'm going to provide it a name property, if I don't, it will call it undefined. And here, I'm not providing a name. When I defined the function, I promised I would give it a name, and then I just totally went back on my promise, right? I don't have a name here. So if I put Joe, now it won't be undefined. It will give me Joe. But because I have a parameter here, and it's the same name as my global variable, if I don't provide this value, it's going to say, you're supposed to give me a name, but then you didn't. So it calls it undefined. Okay. Any questions? This is, I mean, like a lot of other stuff. The more you play with it, the more it'll click. And that's function scoping. Now we'll talk about let and const pretty soon. There's slightly different scoping rules with let and const. They're more strictly scoped to block scopings, which just means that instead of just being inside of functions, variables inside of declared inside of if statements or for loops only exist inside of if statements or for loops as well, including functions. So, but we'll talk about that later. For now, we're just using var for everything. That's fine for now. Okay. We are not going to do this. Okay, so I'm going to post to Slack the exercise functions assignment. And then I'll have you
We'll work on the functions assignment and the color block assignment.
Yep. Yeah. So yeah, anything that is in Trello, I'll add this to Trello, and then yep. Yeah, pretty much work on this until then.